I'd like to talk about what is arguably one of the shortest books that you'll ever see in the New Testament, and it's the book of Philemon, which is really a letter, and it's arguably the shortest of all of Paul's letters. No question, nobody debates that this is part of Paul's letters. The interesting question is whether this is actually connected to some of the others, and one of the interesting theories is that it's connected to Colossians and Ephesians, as there's maybe a group of three of these that were done together. And that, in fact, we have some sense of this because in Colossians in particular, we hear the same person, Onesimus, as part of the letters in this one. And Onesimus is the focus of this particular letter. Okay. So this particular letter is very useful because it is a personal letter to Philemon, who is a church leader, probably in the Asia Minor area that's related to where some of these other the other letters are going. It's a short letter. It's about 25 verses long, not very, very long at all. And it's very useful to look at because, among other things, it's a really good discussion of what is the classic Greco-Roman letter structure, and to kind of see the very basic pieces and parts that often show up in this space. Now, so where you will see a couple key things. There's a greeting. There's usually a thanksgiving, a praise, an introduction into the letter. There's the main rhetoric part of the letter, and then there's the sort of closing details and specific greetings that you see there. And you'll see various parts of this in all of Paul's letters. And so it's actually very useful to see this comparatively, to see the various pieces, how they all fit together. And so this becomes very important here. Now, the other part of this is that this entire letter is carried by Onesimus, who basically was Philemon's runaway slave. So Philemon had still ownership, at least within this in the Greco-Roman context. Onesimus means useful, which is a very typical kind of almost demeaning name that would be given for slaves at the time, but it also means that he is useful. And Paul will play off of this actually in some of the words that he uses here. And what makes it more interesting is that he became a Christian, and now he's quite useful to Paul. And he's quite useful to the overall community, and now this kind of talks about, well, what is this interaction? And so this really deals with, sort of slavery in the Greco-Roman context. And it's important to kind of get a sense of what this was like. But of course, basically what we find is that this whole letter addresses slavery, but it doesn't say slavery shouldn't be there. It would be another millennia and a half till there'd be really any discussion seriously of the elimination of slavery. And that wouldn't really be until the 1700s in any serious sense in both England and in France. Because for most of the world, it was just a normal practice. It was just what was done. It was a typical situation, and across all cultures and in all spaces. Now, there are different pieces in their context. One thing we should be aware of is in the Greco-Roman context, slaves could be educated, although most were not. We also need to understand that Jesus didn't address it. For all intents and purposes, Jesus really didn't cover it. Most of the other letters didn't really address it too much, except that to keep order, and you see that in Ephesians. You see this in a few other places as well. So you really wish that this was, you kind of wish in a modern day context that it would clearly say you shouldn't do it. But that's not where we were, and it took a lot longer to get there. And one could argue, well, why didn't Paul have this insight? And there are a lot of different reasons for that. And, in the end, maybe we can't, entirely pick on him for being a first century individual. But the reality is, over the next 2 millennia, well, how much did we actually improve? And that may be the better question to be asked here. But what's interesting that Paul says here, Paul doesn't ask for his freedom, but he does say, hey, could you please now give him to me, because he's now been useful to me, and let us now build in that. Now let me continue to build the gospel, because now, after all, it is now one of your brothers in Christ. Interesting. That already creates some things there. And Paul makes some very strong statements in here. The comments of, I could be bold and order you to do this. I'm going to appeal to you. Of course, and there's various comments like, well, you do owe me your very self. and confident your obedience, I know you'll do more than I ask. And so there's clearly a sense that Paul knows that he will handle this properly. Now remember, Philemon could say, this is my runaway slave, and had a great latitude of what he could do. And hope, we don't know. We don't know what the answers are. We just don't. It'd be nice, but we're only hearing this piece of the story. But he says, confident of your obedience, I know you'll do more than I ask. Probably it was a good outcome, but again, we don't know. I do find it funny at the very end, in the sort of right at the edge of the closing. Oh yes, by the way, prepare a guest room for me because I plan to come and visit you. There's a little bit of, pushing on these points. And this is very interesting to see, not just the letter, the structure, and the core themes, but also how Paul interacted and how other Christians interacted at this time. And so this letter has, for what it looks like a very short letter, a tremendous amount of depth and interest and things that we can learn from it as we're digging deeper into all of the New Testament.